Not all women flocked to the Patriot side, of course, any more than all men supported calls to resist Parliament. Women like the haughty Grace Galloway, daughter of one of Pennsylvania's richest men and wife of Loyalist Joseph Galloway, viewed revolutionaries as upstarts, and she considered herself entirely above the fray. Only when the revolution was underway and she was forcibly removed from her Philadelphia home did she accept the fact that the rebellion was going to forever change her life. Grace Galloway died in poverty and despair, angered at a world she no longer understood. And I would like to stress the fact that for many people, the revolution was inexplicable. They really didn't understand why this was happening, and they did not realize what the consequences of it would be. She died in poverty, as I said. Like Grace Galloway, many wives of conservative men became victims of the rising antagonism and violence between radicals and those loyal to the crown. Esther Sewall of Cambridge was one of these women whose life was tragically transformed by the coming revolution. Her life had begun well enough. She was born to a notable Massachusetts family, the Quincy's, and she was courted by Jonathan Sewall and by his bosom friend, John Adams. Sewall clearly seemed the wiser choice, for while Adams was short, defensive, and talkative, Sewall was ambitious, witty, and charming. Jonathan and Esther married in 1763, and soon after, his career flourished. He won plum appointments as Solicitor General and then Attorney General of the province, and by the end of the decade, he had captured one of the prized royal appointments to the judgeship in the newly created Vice Admiralty courts. But by 1774, his outspoken and public, he wrote many essays in the newspaper, support of Crown policy made him a marked and hated man. It was not Jonathan, however, but Esther, alone in their Cambridge home with her two young sons, who faced the wrath of local radicals. An angry mob of men and boys surrounded her home and threatened to burn it down and murder everyone in it if Sewall were not turned over to them at once so they could hang him. Esther kept her cool. She went to the door and addressed the mob, explaining her husband was in Boston. Then, keeping her wits about her as rocks were thrown at the windows of her home, she invited the crowd, many of them recognizable neighbors of hers, to come in and sample her husband's extensive wine cellar. Alcohol proved to be a very acceptable substitute for a loyalist blood, and a drunken mob at last departed, leaving Esther and her sons and her home intact. Her trials, by the way, were far from over. By 1775, the Sewalls were living in exile in London. The revolution that soon followed introduced Esther, as it did most Loyalist women, to poverty and to austerity later when the family moved to Canada. But most importantly, it destroyed Esther's marriage, for in London, her husband suffered what we today would call a nervous breakdown. My dissertation in my first book was about Jonathan Sewall, and it was a real treat to discover someone who locked himself in a room for 18 months and sent letters out under the door that made it clear that he was having a complete breakdown. You don't find many of those kinds of documents in the 18th century. By the time he came out of his 18-month retreat, he had decided that the revolution was his wife's fault, that she had caused the American Revolution. He raved against his wife for the rest of his life, which was far too many years as far as she was concerned. And at one point he wrote that he hoped she would be tied to the tail of a comet and carried into space. Ironically, in the same year that the Sewalls fled Boston, Esther's younger sister, Dorothy, made what she too believed was a good marriage, and she was correct. As Mrs. John Hancock, Dorothy enjoyed a life as the wife of one of the new nation's most successful political leaders and one of its richest citizens. Two sisters, their lives shaped so differently by the same war. And let me make a larger point about this. One of the things you discover when you find stories like this is that the American Revolution was a true civil war. Not like the war we call the Civil War, which was the North against the South. The American Revolution was brothers against brothers in the same family, sisters against sisters, cousins against cousins. In every single town, there were families that were torn apart by the American Revolution, and Dorothy and Esther are a very good example of that. As the likelihood of war grew, violent outbreaks like the attack on Esther Sewell's home grew more frequent. Often enough, women were part of the crowds who hurled stones at the windows of known Loyalist houses. One Massachusetts Loyalist described these patriot women as caught up in an epidemical frenzy that rivaled the intensity of their male compatriots. Peter Oliver was absolutely appalled by the presence of women in mobs that tarred and feathered supporters of the Crown. And I'm sure you all know, tarring and feathering is not an amusing activity. It was hot tar poured on someone's body that gave them very serious burns, and removing it required the removal of many layers of skin as well. The feathers were just to shame them. Peter Oliver was so appalled, he said all female restraint and delicacy had been abandoned, and it was as radical a change and as drastic as the political revolution itself. He writes, "When a woman throws aside her modesty, virtue drops a tear." But if Oliver was horrified by women's active role in the streets, patriots like Ezra Stiles applauded the action of women who, he boasted, surpassed the men for eagerness and spirit in the defense of liberty by arms. To Stiles, virtue was not crying, but smiling broadly on the women who supported independence.